China is mobilizing a record number of warships in the Pacific region and accusing the Japanese of interfering with its military exercises, further increasing tensions, which, between China and Japan, are the highest since the end of World War II. Meanwhile, Kellogg, one of the representatives involved in peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, says the agreement is down to just a few details, more precisely, 2. In this video, we're going to discuss what those points are. At the same time, the Pentagon states that the United States will withdraw from its obligations toward NATO by 2027, leaving the responsibility for defending the European continent in the hands of the Europeans themselves. Yet another sign that relations between the United States and the European Union are in terrible shape. It's worth noting that Kaja Kallas and Donald Tusk, key European representatives, are calling for more moderation from the US, but that apparently isn't going to happen, especially because figures like Elon Musk and other international voices have been calling for the end of the European Union. Will that really happen? If you want to better understand these topics, as well as geography, geopolitics, current events, politics, and controversies, all to stay well informed, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the video. I, Professor Robert, am counting on your support. Sound good? Alright folks, let's get into the video. As I mentioned in the introduction, China has indeed mobilized a record number of military vessels this week in an area stretching from the southern part of the Yellow Sea all the way to the highly disputed South China Sea, contested by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and several other countries. The most accurate information came from Reuters, which spoke with officials from East Asian and Southeast Asian nations. They say that at one point, there were around 100 Chinese vessels organized into 4 naval formations. It's a moment of intense tension, both because of the situation involving Taiwan, whose current leader, Lai Ching-te, has a strongly separatist stance, openly defending the island's independence, and because of the strained relations between China and Japan. As we've discussed in other videos, recent remarks by Sanai Takaichi, stating that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would also represent a threat to Japan, were seen by China as an act of insubordination, especially coming from a country that invaded Manchuria and Taiwan before World War II. To Beijing, it sounds like a return to Japanese imperialism. China also claims its military exercises are taking place in waters it considers either international or under its sovereignty. In the case of the Taiwan Strait, Beijing argues that it is not conducting maneuvers against another country, since it sees Taiwan as part of the People's Republic of China. In the South China Sea, the conflict is even bigger. While the UN defines that each country has the right to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, China does not recognize that limit and claims nearly the entire sea, even building artificial islands and installing military bases. Japan has expressed concern. Taiwan has stated that Xi Jinping should show more restraint given the unstable scenario in East and Southeast Asia. Despite that, China accused Japan of interference, claiming that Japanese military aircraft disrupted its exercises, which Beijing insists were legitimate. China has promised some form of response, though we still don't know what it will be. We also had important news regarding Kellogg, one of the representatives involved in the Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations. The United States is acting almost like good cop, bad cop. Kellogg, a general seen as more pro-Ukraine, is not recognized by the Russians as a legitimate negotiator. Meanwhile, Steve Witkoff, aligned with Jared Kushner and viewed as more pro-Russia, has been gaining prominence. When it's time to negotiate with the Ukrainians, they usually send Kellogg. When it's time to negotiate with the Russians, they send Witkoff. And Kellogg's influence has been diminishing, something we've already discussed in previous videos. The US now adopts a posture more favorable to Russia, especially due to Russian advances on the battlefield in the regions of Kupiansk, Kharkiv, the recently attacked dam, and the push toward Pokrovsk, which is crucial for control of Donetsk. Kellogg announced that he plans to step down from his duties in 2026, possibly because he feels his pro-Ukraine views are no longer being considered. But he did bring one piece of good news. The negotiations in Miami between Ukrainian and American representatives are reportedly close to an agreement. According to him, only two major points of disagreement remain. The Donbas region, whether Ukraine will give up territory, accept the Russian occupation, and freeze the conflict, or withdraw its troops and allow Russian advances without formally recognizing the territory, leaving room to renegotiate in the future. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest in Europe. Russia says it must belong to them, as it would supply electricity to Mariupol, Crimea, and other occupied regions. Ukraine rejects giving up the plant. Kellogg compared the moment to a marathon. The last 10 meters are always the hardest. Personally, I'm not that optimistic. I don't believe Zaporizhzhia and Donbas are simply the last 10 meters. Let's be honest, these are extremely sensitive issues, and it's hard to imagine any type of convergence between Russia and Ukraine. In addition, we've been discussing here on the channel how the United States is changing its stance toward NATO and especially toward Europe. The document recently released by the United States, the new National Security Strategy, states that Europeans are undergoing a process of civilizational extinction because they cannot control their borders. Islamic immigrants, according to the document, are entering in increasing numbers and raising the birth rate, while native Europeans have much lower rates. This, the document argues, would provoke a civilizational shift and make Europeans less reliable as historical allies of the US. This scenario means lower military investment. The United States is pulling troops out of Europe, and we had an announcement from the Pentagon during a meeting held this week in Washington, stating that the US will abandon its conventional defense responsibilities within NATO by 2027. This represents a massive paradigm shift. Why? It's important to remember that NATO has undergone major transformations. Created in 1949 by the United States as a collective security agreement to contain a possible Soviet socialist aggression, the organization changed significantly after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. That alliance, originally defensive in nature, began acting more and more offensively, whether you agree with it or not. It intervened in Libya, Iraq, and Yugoslavia, countries that had no direct connection with NATO and had not attacked any of its members. NATO essentially became a kind of military arm of the United States, also defending the interests of Western Europe. At this moment, with the Trump administration adopting a much more nationalist stance, the US says Europeans need to take responsibility for their own defense. In fact, during that meeting, it was established that Europe must assume the majority of responsibilities for conventional defense capability by 2027, from intelligence to missiles. When I say conventional defense, I mean non-nuclear defense, because there is also non-conventional defense, which is nuclear deterrence. And we know that countries like Turkey, Italy, and Germany host US nuclear weapons. In other words, in non-conventional defense, the Americans will continue guaranteeing nuclear deterrence. In conventional defense, the responsibility will shift to the Europeans. According to the US, even with the Russia-Ukraine war, they expected Europe to wake up to the need to invest more in defense. And indeed, military spending did increase, but not enough. Moreover, some countries are still resisting, such as Pedro Sanchez's Spain, which has not committed to raising defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, as agreed by most NATO members. And this raises the big question, are the United States truly abandoning NATO and Europe? It's hard to know whether this reflects the view of the current Pentagon, led by Pete Hegseth, and the Trump administration, or whether it represents the position of the American state as a whole. Let's imagine, for example, that in the next elections, someone like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California and a likely Democratic Party contender, wins the presidential race. Would the United States maintain this more nationalist stance and reduce its support for Europe? The document released by the U.S., nicknamed the Trump Corollary, or the New Moral Doctrine of the United States, lists Asia and Latin America as priorities, placing Europe in second place. But is that a government position or a state position? Personally, I believe this is much more the stance of the Trump administration, not even of Republicans in general, but specifically of the MAGA movement, which is nationalist and less cosmopolitan. Furthermore, abandoning certain responsibilities has serious consequences, because the United States does not contribute to NATO only financially. It also provides intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Will that also be completely abandoned by 2027? The Americans expect Europeans to take over all of that, and in a very short time frame. Let's be honest, we're in December 2025. Practically speaking, it's already 2026. Europe would have roughly 2 years to break a military dependency that has lasted for decades. I believe it's important for Europe to seek autonomy, because many countries became comfortable under NATO's protection. That's a fact. And depending entirely on another major power to guarantee your defense and sovereignty is dangerous. Some areas simply cannot rely on complete dependence. For example, oh, my country doesn't produce food because it's not profitable. Okay, but in the event of war or economic sanctions, will your country starve? There must be food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and Europeans experienced this firsthand. No, it's fine, we'll just import gas and oil from the Russians. Then the war began, sanctions came, and Europeans had to burn coal, pollute more, or buy energy 5 times more expensive, causing inflation, economic crisis, and everything that comes with it. In the military sector, dependence is even more problematic, especially in a moment of a new global arms race. Regarding this distancing of the U.S., we've had important statements, such as those from Kaja Kallas. But it's worth noting that much of this friction between the United States and Europe involves Kallas herself. She was the head of government in Estonia, a Baltic country historically very aggressive in its stance toward Russia. And I'm not saying without reason, okay? But when she took on the role of the European Union's foreign affairs representative, in the eyes of the US, the bloc shifted from being an entity willing to negotiate peace possibilities with Russia to adopting a stance of direct confrontation, wanting to defeat the Russians. To the US, this position is not constructive. The British outlet The Telegraph even reported that, in a pejorative sense, the US accuses Kaja Kallas of promoting the Estonization of the European Union, meaning a belligerent, aggressive posture toward Russia that undermines any peace-building process, and therefore contributes to the growing rift between the United States and Europe. Kaja Kallas gave an interview, a public statement, commenting on the American document that talks about civilizational chaos, the end of European civilization, the excessive bureaucracy of the European Union, and accusations of censorship. She pretty much glossed over the criticism. She said there are many critiques of the US document and that some of them even make sense. According to her, Europe is underestimating itself in relation to Russia. But honestly, I don't think the Americans were talking about Russia. On the contrary, the document points to the need to avoid any posture of accommodation toward the Russians, advocating for a tougher stance. The European Union feels threatened, and Kaja Kallas, due to her origin from the Baltic countries, represents that sentiment well. She said that the European Union should have more self-confidence. As for the United States, she acknowledged disagreements on some points, but said that the overall alignment remains, and that the EU and the US must stay united despite the criticism. Kallas also criticized the pressure Washington is allegedly putting on Kyiv to reach an agreement, arguing that this would encourage Russia to seize more territory in the future. Again, a view that contradicts the priorities laid out by the Americans. In the U.S. document, one of the goals is to normalize relations between the United States and Russia. But that is not on the agenda of Kaja Kallas or the European Union. Donald Tusk, the Polish representative, posted on X saying, "Dear American friends, Europe is your closest ally, not your problem. We have many common enemies. That's how it has been for the last 80 years. We must maintain this stance, as it is the only reasonable strategy for our shared security, unless something has changed." In other words, Europe is worried about a possible U.S. withdrawal from NATO and the potential abandonment of American support for the European Union. Notice how excessive dependence on another country places your own sovereignty at risk. And if the military situation is already complicated for the Europeans, in the geopolitical, economic, and communication fields, things could get even worse. Recently, X received a fine of over 100 million euros for, according to the European Union, not having transparent policies, violating data protection rules, lacking algorithmic clarity, and failing to control the spread of potentially harmful information. The United States, especially under a government strongly supported by big tech, has a much more permissive stance, rejecting regulations. Because of this fine and issues involving X's blue checkmark, which we discussed in yesterday's video, Elon Musk posted a comment comparing the European Union to the Fourth Reich, associating symbols that the platform doesn't even allow to be displayed. Essentially, he suggested that the EU should cease to exist so countries could recover their nationalist prominence. And it's worth remembering that this Eurosceptic movement is growing not only in the US, but also within Europe itself. Brexit is perhaps the biggest symbol of this. The United Kingdom made it clear that it accepted an economic bloc, but not a political superstructure with a parliament, commission, court, and an ever-deepening level of integration, especially after the Lisbon Treaty. Nigel Farage, one of the leading voices of Brexit, summed it up well. "Don't get this wrong. We Brits don't hate Europe. We love Europe. What we hate is the European Union and its institutions. Our ancestors did not envision a common flag, a common anthem, a common army. They envisioned the free movement of goods. And that is not what the European Union is becoming." Today, there is strong criticism from American leaders of the EU's cosmopolitan posture, and here comes the coincidence. On the same day that Elon Musk posted that criticism, Dmitry Medvedev, Dmitry Dmitriev, and Alexander Dugin, a Russian ideologue, also made posts in the same tone. Is Elon Musk acting in coordination with the Russians to weaken the European Union? That's the suspicion raised by many analysts. Poland's response to Musk was, to say the least, curious. The foreign minister said, "Elon Musk, you're complaining about our stance? Then go to Mars. There's no censorship there for people who like making certain gestures." A reference to the gesture Musk made after Trump's victory, a gesture that sparked debate about a possible Nazi salute, which he denied. In short, the relationship between the United States and Europe is terrible. All right, everyone? Did you understand the main developments? Then hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're together. Kisses, hugs, and bye-bye.